The topic for this workshop is why is it important to have policies? Stuff happening in our congregations can be confusing. Don't assume folks know what's going on and why. Here are three ways we try to reduce that confusion. One way is with constitutions and bylaws, which are important and formal documents that are required by law for nonprofit organizations. They can be changed, but only by a two-thirds majority vote of the congregation at a full congregation meeting. Another way is with policies, which can be adopted by the congregation council after a discussion and vote. They can be easily modified by the council as conditions change. Policies are an important segment of good governance. They define for everyone what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. A third way is with procedures, which can be adopted by committees or staff and may often change depending on who is there and what is going on. They are rarely written down and often not widely known throughout the congregation. Procedures define how something is managed or accomplished and don't usually define what is unacceptable. They are less formal than policies. When you follow a procedure, you might ask, why do we do that? Is there an advantage to promoting some of these procedures to policies? Will doing that clarify things and help others? Why do we need policies? Well, policies protect people such as children, teachers, chaperones, treasurers and financial secretaries, and staff. Policies protect the institution by defining information security, building security, and staff safety. Policies reduce insurance premiums because underwriters reward those who plan ahead. Developing policies make leaders think about things before they become a crisis. Forethought is important because the worst time to address an issue is when the house is on fire or the wolves are at the door. Policies clarify the rules that apply equally to everyone for stuff like rents, loaning of property, keys, use of the building, and wedding and funeral procedures. Policies establish who is responsible for what in a congregation, such as who decides if a memorial gift can be accepted, when the building can be rented, if children's pictures can be used on the website, and other stuff. Because people forget, and leaders and even pastors come and go, and motions made at council meetings are quickly lost to history, having a policy manual provides an institutional memory. Once you have policies, they need to be periodically reviewed and updated to keep them current. While it's great to have well-defined policies, it is also important to know what they are and where they are kept. Having all the congregation policies in one concise manual is a perfect way to maintain them. So, you may ask, what types of policies should we have? Well, a comprehensive policy manual will have policies covering personnel, technology security and use, building and property maintenance and use, financial procedures, risk management, and other miscellaneous issues that are important. The upcoming slides will focus on each of the policy categories listed on this slide. There are many reasons to have a comprehensive personnel policy, or if desired, a congregation could have separate smaller policies covering each of the categories listed on this slide. There is an example comprehensive personnel policy manual covering most of the categories at www.elca.org/resources/human resources. You could have a policy on staff recruitment and employment that covers things like who does the staff recruitment, who does the interviews, who makes the hiring decision, what is the compensation package for each position, what are the benefits, if any, how and when to conduct background checks. A personal policy could also include all the forms that a new employee needs to read and or sign. A personnel policy would also normally contain staff job descriptions. Job descriptions are important because they remove any ambiguity about what the job requires. Job descriptions provide the blueprint for expectations and responsibilities and define the specific tasks that must be done. A personnel policy would also define staff performance and behavior expectations and establish performance reviews. It is important to have in writing your level of performance expectations for the congregation staff. Having a policy that defines upfront what behaviors are acceptable and what are not acceptable is a great way to minimize the potential for conflict. While a separate computer and internet policy is necessary, it is doubly helpful to include in the personnel policy some language defining behavior expectations for staff that utilize the congregation's technology. Even though we like to think in a church environment, staff discipline and discharge policies would not be needed, unfortunately, they sometimes are. Having a thoughtful policy on how to deal with disciplinary issues provides a single roadmap for everyone. It will make it much easier to deal with a discipline issue should one arise. In today's world, a policy on sexual harassment guidelines and training is a must. Multiple documents covering sexual harassment can be found under the Sexual Misconduct tab at www.elca.org/resources/legal. And don't forget your volunteers. A policy about their responsibilities and behavior expectations is also important. We all have volunteers who do a tremendous amount of the work needed to further the ministries of our congregation. Nevertheless, many of you have likely experienced someone who is either confrontational or just wants to do it their way, even if it conflicts with the way things have always been done. It is helpful to have a policy defining the minimum expectations of volunteers that covers behavior, safety, technology use, when they can and cannot be in the office or sanctuary areas, and who can use the kitchen and for what purpose. The policy should also include how to deal with someone who just will not follow the guidelines set by the policy. Since Christian education is mostly done by volunteers and many are dealing with children, it is imperative that there be a well-defined policy on expectations and behavior for these positions. Nowadays, having guidelines on how the various electronic equipment at a congregation can be used appropriately is imperative. A clear and comprehensive policy about who can use the electronic communication and data equipment, and that clearly defines what is acceptable use and what is unacceptable use is highly recommended. A comprehensive policy would include network and data security responsibilities and possibly include the minimum training expectations for all staff. A sample congregation computer and internet use policy is available at www.elca.org/resources/legal and click on the Miscellaneous tab. Within the example internet policy document found on the ELCA site, there is a link to another very useful guidance document about social media. This document explains what is social media, gives guidance on how to develop a social media policy, defines the elements of a social media strategy, and details what should be included in a social media manual. If your congregation uses social media, questions to consider are: who is responsible to monitor the social media, and who is assigned to respond if a response is necessary? Many congregations are getting away from paper records and going all digital. Safety and redundancy of the data or documents is extremely important and could be defined in an approved policy. An example information security policy can be found at www.elca.org/resources/information technology. This example policy defines acceptable and unacceptable use, employee responsibilities, copyright issues, and includes an example acknowledgement form that all employees would need to sign before accessing electronic technology at your congregation. There is also a document at that same location on the ELCA website that gives good tips for computer and internet safety. Having a building and property use policy serves at least two purposes. One purpose is to define the parameters to follow for when your building is used for something other than a planned congregation function. For non-congregation use, an example building use agreement and agreement form assigned can be found at www.elca.org/resources/legal under the Property tab. A second purpose for this policy is to detail when and how the building can be used after normal hours by congregation committees, work groups, staff, and members, and would also detail building security measures such as accountability for keys and building security. The policy would cover things like who may have a key, when the building should be locked, who is responsible to make sure it is locked, is the office locked separately and by whom can have access to the office area, who is the keeper of the keys, what to do if a key is lost, and how often should the keys be called back from those who have them. A building use policy could also cover building maintenance responsibilities, expectations, and oversight. If there is a paid staff person, the building policy may reinforce the personnel job description covering the duties and expectations. If there is not a paid position, a policy would define which group has responsibility and what exactly are they responsible for. It would be good to also have a building and grounds maintenance plan to minimize hazards in a policy. This policy would cover basic risk management such as who keeps sidewalks free of snow and ice, who monitors for trip hazards both outside and inside and makes sure they are resolved, who monitors the heating and cooling system and arranges routine servicing, and who monitors the kitchen to maintain cleanliness and food safety. Finances are an important and integral part of any viable congregation. There are both fiscally prudent reasons and required legal reasons for having good policies about the congregation's finances. The needed policy or policies would cover bookkeeping and money handling arrangements, who does it and how is it done to minimize the potential for irregularities, special events planning, funding, and revenue handling. What is the congregation's policy on special events, both for internal organizations and outside organizations using the facility? What rent is charged, and how is the rental income utilized? Guidance for accepting special gifts and memorials. Do you have a plan on what to do with the gift? Do you have a plan about accepting and using or not accepting tangible gifts that are not money? Credit card and purchasing guidelines. Yes, we all have budget line items defining how much can be used for certain activities, but do you have a policy defining who could actually spend the funds, or do you have to have each small expenditure approved by council? If there is a credit card, who has authority to use it? Many resource documents covering finance-related topics are available at www.elca.org/resources/legal under the Finances tab. If there are no bylaws covering special funds, then a congregation really should at least have a policy for each special fund that defines how the fund assets are maintained and what the assets can be used for. Examples of funds include Capital Improvement Fund, Scholarship Fund, Memorial Fund, Pastor's Discretionary Fund, Endowment Fund, Altar Guild Fund, Choir Fund, and I'm sure many others you can think of. There are a variety of risk management related policies a congregation could have. Guidance on risk management efforts can be found at www.elca.org/resources/risk-management and at www.elca.org/resources/legal. Some examples of risk management that may be important are how and where to keep insurance and other important records. It is probably not a good idea to keep the only copy of these records in the church building, as they would be destroyed in a fire. Having a property loss procedure. Who do you call if there is a property loss issue, and who is the person responsible to make the call? Procedures for dealing with embezzlement. Emergency intruder alert awareness and violence threat plan. Contingency plan if the church becomes unusable. Do you have a plan to be able to continue worship or have committee or group meetings if your building becomes inaccessible due to fire, storm damage, or other emergencies? There are several other areas where having a policy in place would be a great benefit to a congregation. Some examples include youth and faith development policies for activities like Christian education, both youth and adult, First Communion, confirmation, protecting children and adults during youth functions, a policy on photograph use for print, web, and streaming media. Are parents able to express their desire to have or not have their children's pictures posted on social media? If so, what is the procedure to do so? Policy on guidelines for Christian weddings and funerals. While generally not an issue for funerals and weddings conducted by your pastor, if you do allow rental of your building to others for weddings and funerals, do you have a policy on what can be done or not be done? And do you have a rental agreement form for the group's representative to sign? A kitchen use policy. Who can use the kitchen? What can be done in the kitchen? And what are the expectations for cleanup? A policy covering kitchen use should not conflict with the health department regulations covering your type of kitchen. Policies on various legal issues such as contracts, background checks, confidentiality, tax, fraud, copyright. Example legal policies can be found at www.elca.org/resources/legal. So, now you have this thing called a policy manual. What might you do with it? Well, it is highly recommended that you keep a copy in the office where anyone can view it. Also, consider placing a current copy on your website and give a copy to each new congregation council member, key volunteer, or staff member when they are first elected, appointed, or hired. This brings folks up to speed. Finally, it is most important to keep the policies up to date. Make sure the policies are updated, added, or removed from the manual before memories fade. After all, the whole point of this thing is to remind you of what you do and why. Thank you for your attention. We will now move into a period for questions and discussion on the topic of policies.